What is up? Welcome to No Punt Intended. As the NFL playoffs keep chugging along, we continue to take a look back at the 2024 fantasy season. Last week, we looked at the good players. We gave you your fantasy MVP. It is Jamar Chase from the Cincinnati Bengals. This week, we're going to go the other route. Who cost you your fantasy season? Let's get into it. What is up? Welcome to No Punt Intended, presented by Club Fantasy. I am your host, Ryan Weisse. No Joe Zolo yet again this week, but Josh Hudson riding with me. How you doing tonight, buddy?
I was going to say, you think of all the days to call into work, this would be the one for Joe because he loves bitching about the people that fucked him over.
So, even more so, Joe sent us like a long diatribe about the Vrabel hiring that I think he wanted us to read on the show, and I forgot to keep my phone
fucking crazy.
So.
He's reading that shit.
Exactly. The long and short of it is, Joe is not a fan of the bullshit way that the NFL handles the Rooney Rule, and why didn't they just let the Patriots hire Mike Vrabel right from the start?
I think you and I can both agree on that.
Again, there are so many things wrong with the NFL and the way they handle young black professionals, but that's not the point of this show, and I'm not going to make you guys listen to me bitch about it for another week. Josh, the playoffs are chugging along. I want to say not too many surprises, but let's start with the first game. Houston and the Chargers did not go the way most people expected that game to go, Joshua.
No, I was very surprised. Honestly, the Chargers just came out flat. And I know like Justin Herbert's going to be the one that catches all the flack about it.
Already happening.
Yeah, of course it's already happening. Oh, he chokes in the big games, blah, blah, blah. Most of your all-time great quarterbacks really didn't start winning in the playoffs till they were like 28, 29 years old, right?
Yeah.
Like, it just takes time. And let's not forget, Justin Herbert's in the same division with Patrick Mahomes. Yeah. Plays in the same conference with Mahomes and Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen and Joe Burrow.
Yeah.
Like, and now CJ Stroud, right? Who in back-to-back years has now made it to the divisional round of the AFC. Like, let's not discount this, okay? So there's a lot of really good quarterbacks in the AFC. Justin Herbert just got the head coach that can help him get through it. Give him some time to actually build this team around him, because for a while, that was never the case. It was, Herbert, you're going to throw us to a title, and you need pieces around him. Plain and simple. You need more than just Ladd McConkey. Plain and simple.
Yeah, I agree completely. And this just goes back to my other favorite thing to bitch about, is that nobody ever gets any time. This is Herbert's fourth coordinator in 4 years, fourth offense in 4 years, right? Or third and three, something along those lines.
Third and three, yeah.
Third and three for sure. And it's just like, these kids got to learn these offenses. And then this is so wildly different from what he did in college and what he's done previously in the NFL. So yeah, I'm one that's always going to give Justin Herbert grace. I like that kid coming out of college. I called him Patrick Mahomes light after watching him play. And that's sort of what he looks like. It's just, he's not as good as Patrick Mahomes, but who the fuck is, man? Give him a break.
Exactly. Yeah. I was just really surprised with that first game. Like, the way that the Texans ended that season, or this season, like,
I thought it was going to
be. Yeah, they came out firing.
They were one of the ones, Josh, I gave no chance to win this game. Pittsburgh, I gave no chance. The Chargers, I gave, or the Texans, I gave no chance. And Green Bay, I gave no chance. I was
2 out of 3, not bad.
Yeah, exactly. But to give someone no chance, and then they do that, you go to the Washington-Tampa Bay game. The two of the games went how you expected them to go. But then you go to the Washington-Tampa Bay game, and it was not so much a surprise. Like, it was kind of what we expected with two teams that have struggled on defense. The quarterbacks played well enough. But then, Josh, you get to the final game. What the hell happened to Minnesota? That is not what you expect, especially when you have to yank a team away.
Sam Darnold.
When you yank a team away from their home field advantage and they still beat you down with just aging assets everywhere. Kudos to this Rams defense. We thought losing Aaron Donald was the kiss of death, but apparently it was not.
That was an absolute masterclass on defense. I was watching a snippet with Dan Orlovsky from ESPN. Him and Stephen A were going at it. And because Stephen A was going through and blaming Sam Darnold. And Orlovsky's like, well, you and I clearly don't watch the same type of football.
Orlovsky was like, I thought you were smarter than this. I'm like, good Lord.
Well, I mean, look, Orlovsky played the quarterback position. Yeah. He's obviously looking at it very differently than even those that know how to watch film and understand the game of football, right? He's looking at it through a quarterback's perspective. There were some things, sure, that Sam Darnold did okay with what he could, because the line just had zero shot. That line got absolutely blown up and overpowered by a young, eager, hungry Rams defensive line.
Absolutely.
This was an absolute masterclass that Chris Shula took right from Aaron Glenn from the week before, because Aaron Glenn's defense in Detroit did the exact same thing to Sam Darnold.
Yeah.
Like, I understand if your line is getting blown up, there's only so much that you can do. Yes, Justin Jefferson was double teamed. He is the best wide receiver in football. If he cannot beat a double team, he's not the best wide receiver in football. Plain and simple. I don't care if he's double covered. Sam Darnold is scared to throw the football into coverage. He's one of these younger quarterbacks that these guys need the targets to be wide open. This is why separation is such a big thing that we track nowadays, because quarterbacks need you 15 steps open. That's it. Because if you're not that open, those interceptions are going to go on them, and then they don't get their contracts and their incentives and all this other crap. Like, it's become such a, if I do this, it hurts me and not just the team kind of thing. And that's the biggest issue with so many of these young quarterbacks. Coaches don't teach them, look, it's okay if you make a mistake. This is how you learn. No. That's why I have a respect for Mike McDaniel and how he worked with Tua. He always said, throw it to your spot. If you throw an interception, we'll time it better next time. Like, that's how it goes. It's okay. You have to make these kind of mistakes to learn. Sam Darnold never got that.
Because everybody gets fired if everybody makes a mistake, and it sucks. It goes back to something, Josh, where we were kind of waffling on this during the season. There are games where Jordan Addison looks like the perfect complement to Justin Jefferson, but in a game like this, you can't shrink when they are focusing on Justin Jefferson. So
yeah, 100%. He was not really getting open. But again, it also boils down to Sam Darnold was scared to throw the football. He was scared to throw the football straight up.
Those ghosts ain't leaving him anytime soon.
Exactly.
Vince says he'd like to separate himself from Kyler Murray in future drafts. Guess what? That's a name that's going to come up here shortly, guys. This is the LVP show, the least valuable player. Before we get into that, like, subscribe, do all the things that you can do to help our channel grow. But actually, yeah, Josh, we didn't really get a chance to talk about news and notes. So let's jump into news and notes. So let me break down the official news and notes. But before I do that, if you guys have not already, make sure you check out our great partnership with Trophy Smack. Josh, the ring thing is still going on?
Yep. Use promo code WOFF, WOFF at checkout. Anytime you buy a championship belt or championship trophy, make sure you have a ring in your cart. When you use that promo code WOFF, you get the ring for free. So get yourself some free bling. TrophySmack.com/WOFF is our unique link. That's WOFF. All of the commissions that we earn when you use that link to purchase any and all of your achievement-based needs, celebrate those fantasy football championships. That allows us to help support women in sports. We have 4 amazing women going to represent women in fantasy football at the Super Bowl. They were officially announced yesterday. 3 of them were repping us at the Super Bowl last year. That'd be Kelly Singh, Renee, who contribute here with Club Fantasy as well. And of course, Samantha Holt from Matthew Berry's Fantasy Life. But the newcomer this year, Miss Cooter Doodle, also from Matthew Berry's Fantasy Life. She is a New Orleans native. Really excited to get her in the Super Bowl streets, as I said yesterday. So
Pure chaos.
That conversation with her yesterday was hilarious, by the way. I'll tell you about it afterwards.
Yeah, that's awesome. As I mentioned, guys, news and notes. We already touched on one of these. Patriots officially hire Mike Vrabel as their new head coach. Dallas doesn't extend Mike McCarthy. And Josh, if I remember correctly, didn't they deny someone a chance to interview McCarthy like 5 days ago? And then they fire him like 2 days later. So
yeah, this is like straight out of the Jerry Jones school of how not to run a business. Yeah. Look, I don't disagree moving away from Mike McCarthy.
I agree.
He's not really a coach that's going to get you over the top. And yes, I know how asinine that sounds considering he has a Super Bowl ring. But that's really why he keeps getting hired, because he has that one Super Bowl ring. Let's be real. That's Aaron Rodgers' Super Bowl ring. It's not Mike McCarthy's. But knowing that you never got to a point where you were exchanging figures to renegotiate and re-up Mike McCarthy, you straight up blocked the Chicago Bears.
That's who it was. Yeah.
From interviewing Mike McCarthy because he's still technically under contract with you. But now all you have done as a franchise is set yourself back from any virtual interviews that you could have had last week with guys like Aaron Glenn or Ben Johnson, right? All this is now off the table. Like, you are starting way behind this process because you couldn't figure out sooner when literally everybody in the media was telling you McCarthy's not that great of a coach. Get off of him.
Yeah.
Jerry Jones and the Cowboys being Jerry Jones and the Cowboys. They care more about headlines than actual on-field production. Which
leads us to, they're reportedly speaking with Colorado Buffalo head coach Deion Sanders. They've also thrown out the names of Kellen Moore and Jason Witten. Okay.
Again, I don't know who it was that actually announced that. I think it was like some media, like Dallas media or something along those lines. But like, get a real candidate.
Did you see the quotes from Deion on what it would take to get to the NFL?
Yeah.
One team to draft both of his kids. So
yeah. And Dallas isn't in a position to draft Shador. So exactly. It's not going to happen.
Not happening if Deion's true to his word, because the other part of it is Jerry Jones can back up the Brinks truck. So that could be interesting as well. The Browns.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, I think that like Deion has a good relationship with Jerry. I think it's more so just having like a casual conversation and less about, hey, come coach my team kind of thing. You know, Deion respects him as a businessman. They've had a good relationship going back to his playing days in Dallas. I feel like it's really just the media taking this and running with it, saying, oh, Jerry wants Deion to be his next head coach because there's a connection there, and they're trying to, connect the dots and get in front of a non-story to make it a story.
I agree completely. The Browns promote their tight end coach to offensive coordinator. Most people just see this as a kowtowing to Kevin Stefanski, essentially taking back over that offense, Josh.
Yeah, I read an article from The Atlantic today. I can't remember who wrote it because I wanted to be able to give credit, but they basically were talking about the albatross of the Deshaun Watson contract and ultimately how they tried to, cater the offense to him. And now with the re-tear of the Achilles, Stefanski just kind of wants to go back to what he did well, which Tommy Rees working within this system works with Stefanski on re-implementing what was working so well before. So, I mean, again, I don't think it's a sexy hire by any means, but Tommy Rees's name has been floating around a little bit. I know he was initially linked to the Patriots and Mike Vrabel. Potentially going there, which of course now, because Tommy Rees took this job, the rumors of Josh McDaniel potentially coming back to New England for a third time now are running rampant in the Boston area.
A big Cleveland media guy, whose name is leaving me right now, but big Cleveland media guy, said that he won't be surprised if Rees ends up replacing Stefanski. That's how popular he is within the Browns organization. So,
I mean, look, he was the coach of the year 2 years ago. Obviously had a very down year this year, but I don't really blame Stefanski so much for that as the owner and front office saying Deshaun Watson's your quarterback, figure it the fuck out.
Yeah, that's true too.
But again, like
the seat's hot.
You can't figure out what you're doing at quarterback for 2025. Yeah. Stefanski may not be there in 2026. 100%.
Diontae Johnson, released by Houston, and Josh, the news today, claimed by the Baltimore Ravens. He cannot play for the Baltimore Ravens in these playoffs, but at least heading into next season, he's a Baltimore Raven. They'll get first rights to offer him a new deal, whatever the hell is going on there. This was a name that was already going to come up in the show, and then he makes the headlines this morning, Josh. So,
yeah, this one, it hurts me to my soul because
So
clearly this is more than just football. It has to be at this point.
yeah.
There's got to be something mental going on. I don't know what, but it hurts because I'm such a big Diontae Johnson fan. I love his play style. I love what he does on the football field, but it's not 2024 was not this man's year at all. And it sucks because it was a contract year for him. Vince, I do not appreciate that slander.
So Vince going off in the chat right now. Yeah. Interesting year, Josh. He was already going to come up in the show. We'll talk more about him a little bit later. I do want to throw this up here before we move out of news and notes because it's relevant. He said the Browns are terrible. Watch him go for Achilles, Kirk. Just want to give a shout out to our guy HoofTube, who did write about Kirk Cousins' future and mentioned the Browns. Actually mentioned it in a positive light. I would urge people to go to clubfantasyffl.com. Check out that article by HoofTube. Kind of breaks down that more as a fan of Kirk Cousins, he doesn't want to see his career end on such a low note and thinks the Browns could work because of the Stefanski matchup. Obviously, Vince may not agree with that. But
well, and I think there's merit to it. I mean, we kind of saw the blueprint for this when Denver cut bait with Russ and how Russ was able to ultimately sign for the veteran minimum.
Yeah.
Because he's still making 30-40 plus $1 million.
Literally how Hoove approached the
the Falcons are going to eventually do the same thing. Kirk Cousins has a no trade clause. He's going to hold it against them the same way that Derek Carr held it against the Raiders to get out of that contract before choosing where he would ultimately sign next. Kirk Cousins has that leverage. So for all of the front that Atlanta wants to do, saying we're happy with Kirk Cousins in a backup role, Kirk Cousins isn't happy in a backup role. I can tell you that right now. The first year after the Achilles is always the hardest.
Yeah, exactly.
Bouncing back at the quarterback position is a hell of a lot easier than it is for a running back or a wide receiver where you need to run a lot more. Kirk Cousins has never been the most mobile, but you still need to use your legs because those are your plant feet, right?
Yep.
Especially in your quarterback stance. So I ultimately, I think that could very well be one of the landing spots. I think Minnesota will be a very interesting landing spot and a situation that will come up a lot. And simply because obviously his ties there with Kevin O'Connell having been the quarterback there previously, but given his age and performance last year, does he want to go and back up JJ McCarthy coming off of an injury? It's a whole thing. So,
yeah, lots to talk about there. But let's actually get into the episode now. As I mentioned, last week we did MVPs. Jamar Chase was the unanimous vote between Josh, Joseph, and myself. He is your 2024 fantasy MVP. But guess what? There's another side of that coin. These are the folks that let you down. The LVPs, the least valuable players from the 2024 season. Much like last week, we broke it down into 3 separate qualifications. We have the injury qualification, meaning we had high hopes for these guys. There was a season-ending injury or a lingering injury, and something outside of their maybe choice caused the problem and their control. Thank you, Josh. ADP. Who did you draft too highly? Whose value was way too high and they did not live up to expectations? And finally, unrealized potential. And this is more the gut calls. These were the players that specifically us 3, but maybe a lot of us thought were going to be really good this year, even if they weren't drafted extremely high, and they just let us down. So we are going to break it down into those 3 sections, and we're going to start with injuries, Josh. So I'm going to rattle off this list of players. Guys, if we missed anybody, I feel like we did a really good job with this list, and you guys are going to start dropping a whole bunch of people who cost you your season in the chat, and they're probably in this list somewhere. But Josh, when we start with the injuries, we start with Deshaun Watson. Obviously, it was a rough year. He ADP was QB 22. Obviously, he didn't matter much in single QB leagues. Only played 7 games, only averaged 11 points per game, which for
that's really the only reason why I put him on that list. A starting quarterback, 11.4 fantasy points per game.
Yeah.
Atrocious.
Dak Prescott personally let me down. Drafted as the QB10. I thought it was such a value. Only ended up playing 8 games. Still only averaged 15 points per game. Not great. Most of these numbers we give you folks are going to be 4-point touchdowns. We understand that the world uses 6-point touchdowns, but data providers do not. So you'll have to live with us. Daniel Jones is drafted as the QB32. Played 10 games, 14 points per game. Trevor Lawrence, QB16, was drafted. Only played 10 games, 15 points per game. Tua Tagovailoa, QB14, drafted, only played 11 games, 17 points per game, though. Christian McCaffrey obviously has to come up. We're going to talk about Christian McCaffrey. He was the ADP RB1, World 1, played just 4 games, only averaged about 12 points in those 4 games. Kenneth Walker, ADP 17, only played in 11 games, but did average 16 points per game, finished the season as the RB27. Nick Chubb, RB33, only played in 8 games, 8 fantasy points per game, finished as the RB60. Isaiah Pacheco, RB10, he was drafted as, finished as the RB64 because he only played in 7 games. I'll be honest, Josh, I didn't remember when Pacheco's injury happened. So to see him average out as the RB10 in ADP, according to Fantasy Pros last year, was kind of crazy. As we move into the wide receivers, AJ Brown was drafted as the wide receiver 6, finished as the 20th, only played in 13 games. He was the wide receiver 13 in points per game. Brandon Ayuk, wide receiver 16, drafted, finished as the wide receiver 105. I forgot to list how many games he played, but it wasn't many. Christian Kirk, drafted as the wide receiver 33, finished as the wide receiver 95. And Evan Ingram, it was a bad year for the Jaguars, drafted as the tight end 7, finished as the tight end 33 in 9 games played. Josh, let's talk Christian McCaffrey.
I found this really interesting because when we get down a little bit later in the show sheet where the 3 of us are going through and putting our nominees, you and I both said Christian McCaffrey.
Joe said
Joe
somebody
puts
else.
Kyle Shanahan.
Yeah.
Which it really kind of makes me think because, yes, it's very easy for us to get upset with Christian McCaffrey because most of us, if we had Christian McCaffrey on our team, it was because we had the 101.
Yep.
And we got 4 games out of it.
Yep.
But we could have better prepared for this.
It was terrible.
If Kyle Shanahan had just been truthful, right?
Yes, and I mean, I think fantasy managers also need to learn. Christian McCaffrey seemed like that golden goose, but like we knew what the injury was and we wanted him to be healthy, but we knew what it was and we maybe should have just backed off of taking him at the 101 because literally any other person with that first round ADP would have been a better pick. Plain and simple.
Yeah, and I mean the whole point and again, we talked about this a lot last week, right? The whole purpose in thinking and saying, you know what, Christian McCaffrey is the unquestioned 101. Take the injury out of the equation. He's the 101 because of what he does on the football field with the ball in his hands.
Yep.
How electric he is, not just running the ball, but catching passes. 49ers use him in all facets. They give him the football 70% of the time. Like he's on the field all the time. Scores a ton of touchdowns, right? Tied for the league lead last year in touchdowns.
Yeah.
He scored 11.9 fantasy points per game in those 4 games this year.
Yep.
That to me is truly why he is on this list. Because
100%.
Again, for me, it's really easy to blame Kyle Shanahan. It's really easy to, get mad at the coach speak and the hiding of the injuries and, all of this other stuff. But he wasn't even productive when he was on the field.
Exactly.
So whether that injury was lingering, you wouldn't have gotten 101 had he played.
Yeah.
Like there were so many other running backs that flew past this points per game number.
Christian McCaffrey's best game of this fantasy season was 79 yards on 19 carries, 4 catches for 27 yards. That's the best you got from Christian McCaffrey this season.
That's awful.
Yeah.
That is not Christian McCaffrey. That's
and now we pretty sure those are Luke's season-long numbers.
My point exactly.
Vince does bring up that Trent Williams is the number 1 asset there, and he hasn't scored a single point. But I think Trent Williams proved that again this year. Josh, the real question that we need to ask, and this is probably for next week's episode or the week after, but How worried are we based on these 4 games for Christian McCaffrey next season? He's a older gentleman with apparently tendonitis and 2 different Achilles. I don't know if that goes the fuck away, Josh, because I'm not a doctor, but it's certainly scary enough that I'm not touching him in the first round of a single draft. That's for sure.
Yeah, I think kind of where I would put him would be like RB9 to RB12 range. That's being conservatively high, if that makes sense. But I'll revisit the Sneaky Girls conversation with Stephania Bell, who we all know is a renowned injury expert when it comes to fantasy football.
Only person worth listening to.
But yeah, it's very much worth listening to. She's also a huge 49ers fan.
Yes, she is.
Has interviewed Christian McCaffrey, talked to him plenty of times, knows him a lot better than you or I ever will, and said that this season is not how he wanted to play, right? And we all know that. Nobody wants to be hurt and perform like shit. But players like that have that level of competitiveness, they come back with a vengeance, right? Yeah. Talk about everybody was writing off Derrick Henry.
100%.
He was toast. He was done, right? Yes, you pair him with Lamar Jackson, good things are going to happen. But he set career highs in yards per carry this year at 30 years old. So I'm not going to sit here and doubt Christian McCaffrey.
Yeah.
But I'm also going to be hesitant because tendonitis is a real thing. Look how fast Todd Gurley fell off a map.
Yeah. Yeah, there was that whole graphic where Todd Gurley was only like 28 and like retired from the NFL or whatever. So
yeah. So that's what I'm saying. Like you got me with the tendonitis part of it. Like you start mentioning that, now I'm starting to backtrack a little bit. I'm gonna let the offseason play out, but as of right now, that's kind of where I put him heading into next year's draft.
And Josh, I'm the one who added AJ Brown to the list, and I didn't know where to put him because I wouldn't call him a terrible value. Wide receiver 6 to wide receiver 20 is not ideal, but it's not terrible value. He's certainly not a disappointment like we're going to talk about in the third category, but he did only play 13 games, and seeing his name as wide receiver 20, I felt like there's no way any of us are going to call him the least valuable player on our fantasy team, but I felt like he needed to be brought up here because he certainly didn't do what we expected him to do.
Yeah, I mean, I highlighted him simply because, I mean, look, when you draft somebody to be a top 6 and you only get wide receiver 13 in points per game, like that's going to be a disappointment. Yeah. I personally would have had Brandon Ayuk in this scenario because, I mean, even when he did play, very similar to Christian McCaffrey, you weren't getting anything close to top 15.
I had Ayuk on the list. I just forgot.
Yeah, you did. Yeah.
Games. Okay.
Yeah, I know. But I wanted to highlight AJ Brown because as somebody that drafted a ton of AJ Brown this year,
absolutely. That's why I thought you would want to talk about him.
I was really not happy with him on my team.
Yeah.
Just throwing that out there. Every single team I had AJ Brown in, I didn't finish any higher than second. Wasn't really helping me win. High draft costs, and you don't help me win, you're not very valuable to me, plain and simple.
Yeah, at least this year we can blame it on the injury, and I don't think it's going to be a problem for future years. So this year we're going to call it
so much the injury, though.
I just meant the missed games.
This team just did not want to throw the football.
I see what you're saying, though. You're saying regardless of the 4 missed games, you weren't happy necessarily having him in your lineup a lot of these weeks. So.
This was the first year of Jalen Hurts as a full-time starter where he did not throw 3,000 yards.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm looking at the numbers right now, Josh. He obviously started hot, and then the injury happened. So he started 23 points, comes out of that with 23, 20, but then just falls off of a cliff. 13, 5, 16, 11, 23, 11, 8, 25, 23, 12. Nice end of the season, but definitely a more boom or bust season than we hope for AJ Brown.
Yeah, I'm hoping there's a bounce back in there somewhere. Obviously, him with 1 catch for 10 yards and a book reading session on the sideline in a playoff game isn't always the best look heading into the next year for fantasy managers. So, yeah.
Yeah, so just the question in the chat is, wasn't he averaging 20 points per game? I know this is good. He was averaging 16 and he was still only the wide receiver 13 on a points per game basis, which is why I think he deserves in here. And Vince caught me with the points there already, but it's why I think he deserves here. But again, I put him on here knowing not one of us was going to call AJ Brown our least valuable player. There are certainly more deserving candidates, and we're going to move on to the next category here in just a second. But I want to get Dan Culpa up here, who has a dynasty question for us. And Dan, I'm going to start by letting you know, Josh and I both play Dynasty. We both understand Dynasty, but we are not the Dynasty experts necessarily. I believe our Dynasty show is on a small hiatus right now. Correct, Josh? So we will
should be coming back next month.
We will have some Dynasty content for you here. Make sure you hit that like and subscribe button, Dan, if you haven't already. But that's not to say Josh and I don't know what the fuck we're talking about. So 1 QB, half PPR, Josh. He got offered George Pickens for his Jalen McMillan. How do we feel about that?
I mean, just on the surface, it should be Pickens being the most valuable, right? Like,
seems that way.
You should take the Pickens side. I am a renowned George Pickens hater.
Yes, you are.
And we will get to him a little bit later in this show.
That
said, there's a lot of variables when it comes to Jalen McMillan. And I say that because does Tampa re-sign Chris Godwin? If he does, now Jalen McMillan is a wide receiver 3. George Pickens is a wide receiver 1. He's going to be the wide receiver 1 next year.
Exactly.
Yes, he was the wide receiver 40-something on the year. It's a very different offense, but there's not a ton of cohesiveness and consistency in that Steelers passing game to where I understand why you may not want Pickens. In dynasty circles, Pickens is more valuable than McMillan.
100%.
Plain and simple. So this would be a situation to where if I was looking at this trade, I would start surveying my league mates while I'm pondering this deal and being like, hey, what would you give up for George Pickens?
Yeah.
That's how I shop, baby.
Yeah.
Because I don't like holding on to assets I don't want to play, plain and simple.
It's interesting, Josh. I actually updated my dynasty rankings over on Football Guys this morning. And Jalen McMillan was a guy who I went in and looked for because I knew he needed to move up. And George Pickens was a guy I went and looked for because, Josh, as you're aware, I was way too high on him during the season. He was a guy who needed to move down. And it's so interesting we got this question. I had to actually go pull my rankings up because, Josh, George Pickens is my wide receiver 29 and Jalen McMillan is my wide receiver 30. They are right next to each other. So now.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, like, I feel like if, like, this is basically somebody trying to move off of George Pickens.
100%.
Because they know the type of headache that he is as a real life player. That extends to rostering him because you don't know when to start him, plain and simple. Yeah. Like, it's very easy to get into his head. It's very easy to throw him off his game. And then he ends up with games like he did 2 weeks ago where he's got 6 targets and 1 catch for 0 yards. But then you also see where he can go 8 for 130.
Yeah.
Because he has that kind of talent, right? McMillan is clearly in the better offense. That's not up for debate.
Yeah.
Baker Mayfield is that fucking dude. Russell Wilson is not that fucking dude, right? May not even be the Steelers starting quarterback.
That's what I was going to say. We don't even technically know that for Pickens.
Pickens is a free agent in 2 years. So he could find himself in a much better situation. But again, now you're looking at Jalen McMillan, where maybe he's still the wide receiver 3 in Tampa next year because Chris Godwin is re-signed. He's able to come back from the injury a little bit sooner. But maybe he moves on. And then you've got a wide receiver 2 in a really good offense with 10 touchdown potential because Baker just threw for 40 fucking touchdowns.
Yeah.
Like, so I'm kind of with you, Ryan. I'm fine having them sort of like lockstep, but I think you really have to ask yourself, if you were to trade one of these guys, what's the better return you would get? Because to me, that's how I think in Dynasty. I think in terms of where's the value spikes. Yes, I want to win, sure. McMillan is going to help you win a lot more than George Pickens. I don't think that, to me, is really up for debate.
I won't say a lot more.
But again, when you're looking at return on investment, because in Dynasty, you're looking long-term. You're looking 2 and 3 years down the road. Is Jalen McMillan ever going to be a wide receiver 1? Probably not.
Unlikely, but I would say not impossible. 2 years down the road, you're likely looking at no Mike Evans or Godwin there. So
yeah, we've already seen George Pickens as a wide receiver 1.
That's true.
We're going to see him as a wide receiver 1 next year.
That's true.
Probably going to see him as a wide receiver 1 in 2026.
The role seems safer.
That's my point.
And so the way I play Dynasty is because they offered you, I would ask them to include a 3rd round pick, maybe even a 2nd round pick. I have these players close enough that I'm willing to make that deal, but see if you can get them to sweeten the pot. Always room for counter offers in Ryan Weiss's trade world.
This is true.
The role throws in that T. Higgins is criminally underrated. That was last week's show. Higgins did get mentioned in the MVP show. He didn't make the final show, but he was someone, and we've been owning up to this for about a month now. T. Higgins changed a lot of our minds about T. Higgins over this last month, and we'll be real interested to see where he plays.
Amazing what a contract year can do for somebody.
Yeah. And then Dan follows us up with what do we think is going to go on with Godwin? He mentions that he saw the Raiders. I haven't dug deep into Godwin yet. Personally, Josh, again, you know how I am for consistency. I hope, and I think he probably stays in Tampa.
Yeah, I think he probably stays in Tampa. It's where the roots are. Jason Lick, the GM, who's been there for a very long time. There's a lot of sense of loyalty within that organization. They do tend to take care of some of their longer tenured players. But I think I think the Raiders make a lot of sense because of Tom Brady being a minority owner and having a lot of sway in that decision-making process. I think Carolina makes a lot of sense as well because of his ties to Dave Canales. You know, Canales was their OC 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And we know how Godwin fits into that offense. But again, a lot of it's going to boil down to the recovery process from this knee injury because he's going to be signing a contract where he's not fully healthy. So there may not be a ton of incentive for him to leave because he's not going to get that multi-year offer. If you're only going to get a 1-year deal, stay at home.
Stay at home. Stay at home on a team that just made the playoffs without you and could probably do a little bit better with you. Josh, I think this gets real interesting. He says the owner likes McMillan, but he has an offer right now of a 26 first and Spears for Pickens. Would you not immediately trade for Pickens and then go to that person and take the 26-1 in Spears? I would. I'll take the one.
I would do. But again, this is what I was literally just talking about. Survey the league, figure out what you could ultimately get for Pickens. If I can get a 26 first for Pickens, I'm doing that because I'm not getting a 26 first for McMillan.
Yeah, Dan, you said it's you paid fab. You didn't even have to draft McMillan. Take Pickens and then go take that deal. That's that one. The most valuable piece that everything you've mentioned is the 26 first.
Spears to me is just the throw-in. Like I would take Pickens for just the solo.
Yeah. And then if you're a contending team, hang on to Spears. If you're not a contending team, immediately flip Spears. And then you just turn Jalen McMillan into a 1 and a 3.
Or 2.
Congrats. Yeah, absolutely. All right, Josh, moving on. As we mentioned, the first category was injury. This category is what most people traditionally consider the bust. Someone that you spent high draft capital on and did not live up to the draft capital. I'm going to rattle off the list. We're going to talk about some of these guys. Patrick Mahomes, ADP QB2, finished as the QB11. CJ Stroud, drafted as the QB5, finished as the QB25. Anthony Richardson, LOL, drafted as the QB6, finished as the QB18. We could have talked about him in the injury category, but this is the category he belongs in. Jordan Love, QB9 drafted, finished as the QB16. Breece Hall, moving on to the running backs, drafted as the RB3, finished as the RB16. Travis Etienne, drafted as the RB8, finished as the RB35. Tyreek Hill, drafted as the wide receiver 2, finished as the wide receiver 18. Marvin Harrison, drafted as the wide receiver 9, finished as the wide receiver 30. Deebo Samuel, drafted as the wide receiver 15, finished as the wide receiver 44. Josh, I'm shocked you did not highlight him just to yell at me again.
I thought about it, but I was like, you know what? I've rubbed this in Ryan's face too
long. Travis Kelce, drafted as the tight end 1, finished as the 5. Doesn't sound like a disappointment, but when you think about fantasy tight ends, it's a disappointment. Sam Laporta, drafted as the tight end 2, finished as the tight end 8. And Dalton Kincaid, Dalton Kincaid, drafted as the tight end 5, finished as the tight end 30. And yes, he missed some games, but tight end 5 was too fucking high to be drafting. Dalton Kincaid. Josh, it's become the Club Fantasy mantra. We told you guys not to draft Anthony Richardson.
Straight up. I mean, I was beating the drum all off season that we are a year too early. Yeah. That was my swan song with Anthony Richardson. It wasn't so much that, he straight up sucks, like Joe Zolo has said on numerous occasions.
Yeah.
I understand that there's a lot of potential with this kid, and I understand that's why a lot of people were really high on him. But before this season, he had 4 career NFL starts and 12 career starts in college.
Yeah.
That is not what a top 5 fantasy QB is to make, plain and simple.
It's not caught up on this rushing upside, man.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I went in. I've got some notes here.
I know.
So, what's up?
I said, I know. I just, like I said, we get too caught up on this rushing upside.
Well, exactly. And what we've been talking about, especially over the past few weeks, has been it's still a passing league. You have to be able to throw the football to make ends meet, not just in real life, but also in fantasy. These top quarterbacks in fantasy that are getting all of these points rushing, guess what? They're throwing the football too.
Yeah.
Jalen Hurts before this year, never a season under 3,000 passing yards. Josh Allen, never a season under 3,000 passing yards. Jaden Daniels this year, 3,000 passing yards.
Yeah.
3,500, actually, if I'm not mistaken. Lamar Jackson just threw for 4,100 passing yards to go along with 900 rushing yards.
Yeah.
Okay. There is not a world out there where in his second season as a starting quarterback, Anthony Richardson was throwing for anything close to that.
No, I had him as maybe 1,000-yard rusher, but the passing numbers never got him there. For me, he kept coming in around like QB 15 for me, but then I bought into the hype and moved him up, like just because I didn't. When I say moved him up, I did not move him up to QB 6 or whatever. I think he got to like QB 12, where I was like, he's the last draftable quarterback, and I still don't know how much I even believe that at the time. So
he was my QB 15.
Yeah.
Like I thought that was like still high, truthfully, but and I was lower on Daniels, but again, I only had him at 3,100 passing yards. So that's kind of where that disconnect came from. And of course, all the injuries that, you can't predict effect there, but I digress. At the end of the day, 48% completion percentage from a quarterback is not going to make fantasy.
That's the thing. The kid can't throw, plain and simple, accurately.
He cannot throw at all. But I want to bring up a recent article that Dwayne McFarland from Fantasy Life put out. And I don't want this to come across like I'm trying to dunk on Dwayne McFarland, because I have a lot of respect for what he does in his work. But the article was all about like basically his missed calls, right? And Anthony Richardson was one of his biggest misses. And he spends a lot of the time in the article walking people through his process and why he was trying to tout Anthony Richardson being a viable fantasy quarterback. Basically, since 2011, quarterbacks who handled 20% or more of their team's rushing attempts averaged 21.9 fantasy points with an average finish of QB5. That's a big stat, and I get that. Yeah. He goes on, he mentions a lot of different stats, and I get that. Yada, 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 et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The two biggest comparisons here that I want to bring up, because he mentions, and he calls out specifically Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen, right? As examples of this is what Anthony Richardson can be. So this is why I am in on Anthony Richardson. And it's okay to be that. That doesn't mean you have to go all in, because that's what you were doing at his QB6 ADP. Because at one point in the offseason, it was QB3. It was that high until people kind of started to smarten up. But this is where I strongly disagree with this. Like, yes, you can point to all of that rushing, which is great. But when you look at all of those quarterbacks, like even when Tim Tebow was doing what he was doing from a fantasy perspective, and we were starting him because of what he was doing with the rushing and not doing with the passing, he still wasn't a top-end QB option. He was a streamer at best. And yet, we're putting Anthony Richardson in a full-on, you start the whole season as this. Not the way, right? Jalen Hurts in college never had a season under 60% completion percent. He played 56 games in college. And mind you, was a finalist for the Heisman Trophy as senior
compared to 12.
Oh, I'm getting there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Josh Allen, while at Wyoming, had a 3,200 passing yard season. Yes, both those years where he started, he was under 57% completion percentage. Still not 48%, by the way. But he started 25 games. Okay. A-Rich started one season at Florida. One. It was 12 games. And he was under 2,600 passing yards. So for all that he could do with the arm strength and running the football, you still have to throw the football. And again, now you want to translate to the NFL, right? Jalen Hurts started 4 games that his rookie year because of the whole Carson Wentz situation. From his second season on, which has been 4 years, he again has not had a single season completing less than 61% of his passes. Okay, again, not 48%, not even 50%. Hurts, and I mentioned this earlier, this was his first year under 3,000 passing yards.
Yeah.
Josh Allen has thrown for 3,000 passing yards every single year except for his rookie year.
Yeah.
And every year since year 3, he has been above 63%. But they are starting games, right? Anthony Richardson the last 2 years has missed 19 games.
Exactly.
You cannot learn how to throw the football if you're not on the field to actually throw the football.
Yeah.
So that's why that ADP never, ever made sense. Even if you extrapolate what he did on the ground this year, it gave you 131.1 fantasy points. That's just rushing. Okay. He was only on pace for 9 touchdowns and 771 rushing yards. Those total rushing yards would have been third behind Lamar and Jaden Daniels. Again, those guys were both over 3,500 passing yards. Lamar threw 41 touchdowns. Anthony Richardson was never going to give you a top 5 season. Even if he would have hit 3,000 passing yards, he was on pace for 20 interceptions.
Well, and
so
that's
let that sink in.
I'll say that was the last piece I was going to add to it was just watching him play. It's a bazooka attached to his arm. He can't slow the ball down. I watched, I can't remember the exact play at this point, but it was one of the plays where he needed to get them into field goal range. And he fired this ball so hard. And I'm just like, that's not what this play called for. And if he had just put a little touch on this ball, Pierce would have caught it. But instead, I think it was picked off 5 yards behind Pierce because he can't put any touch on a ball. And this is just what you get from Anthony Richardson. And like, there are folks who are going to buy right back in next year. I would need to see 2 years, or at least 1 year of changed mechanics before I will ever buy in on Anthony Richardson.
And that's the biggest thing is like after this colossal bust of a season, and I'll go back to Dwayne's article because he mentions this, his ADP is now going to be depressed.
Yep.
Like you can't go into this season being such a colossal failure and shoot right back up to QB6 ADP, no matter the potential that comes with it, because everybody's already been burned.
Yeah.
So now he becomes a value. He becomes somebody that once you draft your starter, you can draft in the later rounds and stash, because if he does pop off and actually showcases that potential, now you have either a trade piece or somebody that's going to win you your league.
No, it's a trade piece.
And that's how you approach Anthony Richardson in 2025.
Plus, you'll be able to stash him on the IR when he's hurt after week 1. So
there you go. Or just drop him outright and, you know, you only wasted a 12th round pick.
Exactly. I think less focus, at least on our show, was placed on CJ Stroud, but what a colossal disappointment this season, Josh.
Yeah, I talked about him throughout the season, how he morphed into a game manager at quarterback.
Yeah. I mean,
there was at one point this offseason where on Keep Trade Cut, which is very much for dynasty purposes, he was the QB1.
I say, Josh, I own my mistakes. For about 2 months on my Football Guys rankings, CJ Stroud was my dynasty QB1. I bought the fuck in, and I got smart, and I moved Josh Allen back to the top, and Jalen Hurts and Mahomes and all those guys back ahead of him. I think he finished as finished as QB5. I don't know what I've moved him to recently, but I bought in hook, line, and sinker, Josh. I loved what I saw from this kid, and I did not see this regression coming.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the injuries at wide receiver played into a lot of this, but this is a team that wanted to run the football. You've got a defensive head coach. You want to run the football, control the clock, play good defense. There's not a defensive head coach out there that wants to throw the football 650 times. I can promise you that. CJ Stroud came in last year slinging because they didn't have a solid running game.
Yeah.
Now they do with Joe Mixon. So he went from QB5 to a points per game finish of QB 25.
Terrible.
If you actually don't take minimums into the equation, he finished as the QB 32 in points per game.
Wow.
Jimmy Garoppolo, Joe Milton, Tanner McKee, and Marcus Mariota all averaged more fantasy points per game than CJ Stroud.
Joe Milton, who received an MVP vote from the chat in last week's MVP episodes.
Exactly. So, if you spent that high draft pick on CJ Stroud, you were not a very happy camper in 2024.
I play my home league, 18-year home league is a keeper league, and only the most elite quarterbacks get kept. It's a 1 QB league. It's just not seen. I had a guy who bought into CJ Stroud the way I did, not because of me, I hope, and went and got Stroud and kept him, finished last place this year. It just blew up in his face. So
yeah, that's rough.
He thought Stroud was the answer. Stroud was in fact not the answer. Speaking of that same guy, actually, Josh had Travis Etienne as well. And I think Etienne was this case where for a few weeks this season, the Tank Bigsby truthers thought they were very, very right. But honestly, I think Jacksonville just sucks, plain and simple.
Well, Jacksonville definitely sucked. There was certainly that. Obviously, we know Etienne had some injuries that he was dealing with. He would, come into games, leave games early. But for a guy that, he had 268 carries last year.
Yeah.
They used him like a workhorse. Yeah. They used him like a workhorse. And then basically said, you're a scat back now. That doesn't happen. And I don't know who he pissed off in that Jacksonville coaching room, but he had 18 less carries than Tank Bigsby, 5 less rushing touchdowns. And we know how bad Tank Bigsby was in 2023. So maybe this is just a product of a young player catching his bearings and figuring out the business and the schemes and the, all that, whatever. Because there were a lot of people that were a lot smarter than me that said, look, Tank Bigsby is going to be a thing. He's a good running back. Ignore the fact that he was on a shitty Auburn team. But this is now back-to-back years where Travis Etienne is below 4 yards a carry, but 3 straight where he has at least 35 receptions.
Yeah.
He's going into his 5th-year option year where they can outright, they could cut him, but it's dead money. Whereas if they trade him, there's no dead money, and it frees them up $6.1 million.
Yeah.
With the resurgence of the running back in 2024, I think you're going to find some teams that might say, hey, Etienne can be our guy for 300 touches in a year. And if I'm the Chargers, I'm making that call.
Yeah, you've been pitching this Chargers thing for a while. So
I'm just saying, Dobbins ain't it. He's clearly not full health from that Achilles.
Dobbins could be a nice complimentary back to Etienne.
Well, and there you go. But again, now you're depriving me and every other person that likes Travis Etienne of a 300 touch season, which he's capable of doing.
Well, to be fair, I think Etienne
and the Chargers will have a better offensive line.
Yeah, I think Etienne could get 300 touches if we're talking 225 and 75, and that still leaves a bill 25 for Dobbins more than likely. I think there's a world where
Greg Roman offense throw that much to running backs.
Yeah, that's
fair.
To me
is the biggest problem.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fair. Josh, I don't think we need to spend a ton of time on Tyreek Hill. I think there are probably some teams out there that will say he is their least valuable player just because you draft Tyreek Hill to get the wide receiver Christian McCaffrey, the guy who can put up QB weeks. And that was not Tyreek Hill this season. You can talk about Tua being out some games, but honestly, this offense just didn't click this season.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it boils down to points per game, right? Because, I mean, you look at, he finished as a wide receiver 18, like, it's a drop off, sure. Like, he basically went from, a guy that could finish as the overall wide receiver 1 to, a middling wide receiver 2. But
yeah,
he's wide receiver 32 in points per game. Like, that's barely a wide receiver 3. Like, that is not good value at all.
Only 3 games.
As banged up as he was, he did not miss a game.
I was just going to say only 3 games with more than 20 fantasy points without missing a game this season.
And I know how bad this offense was when Tua went out. So, sure, there's a lot that plays into that. But, I mean, if you're the top dog, like, fucking Malik Neighbors played with 4 different fucking quarterbacks and finishes the wide receiver 6. Like, if you're a good wide receiver, your coaches figure out how to get you the fucking football.
Yep. And now he wants out of Miami, which I think is interesting. We'll see how that whole situation plays out. And Josh, I think this show could probably almost take as big a victory lap on Dalton Kincaid as we do on Anthony Richardson, because none of us were bought in that much. I was. Oh, were you?
Okay. And I've told you this. He was my tight end 2 heading into this.
That's
season.
Right. Okay. Well, then never mind. We can't take that victory lap as a show anyway. Yeah. Well, I'll let you talk about. I'll let you talk about that, but I don't think even me. I think he felt like tight end 5 for me or something. Like I get like where he was being drafted, but to finish as bad as he did. But when you look at the games, Josh, I said this a few weeks ago. I'm concerned about Kincaid in general now. 7.8 fantasy points on a team that desperately needed a wide receiver 1. This doesn't jive with the fantasy narrative that we see with these tight ends in these situations. Only 3 games this entire season with double-digit fantasy points. That's just pathetic in a week where you can be a top 10 tight end by catching 1 ball for a touchdown.
Yeah, I mean, this is a team that, Josh Allen threw for what? 3,700 yards.
Yeah.
And they didn't have a single player over 900, actually over 821. That was Khalil Shakir at 821. Everybody else was under 600 receiving yards. There was plenty of opportunity. And Khalil Shakir Dalton Kincaid, was second on the team in targets. Like, he had opportunity and just didn't do anything with it. I understand Josh Allen and Joe Brady. Like, Joe Brady wants to spread the football around. He doesn't really want like one dominant pass catcher. But when you're seeing 75 targets, like, that's still a pretty solid baseline for a tight end.
Exactly.
Only had 2 touchdowns. This guy's like 6'5".
Only had 2 touchdowns
6'6".
and only 10 yards.
What we talked about with Keon Coleman, right? Like, these are big red zone guys. Like, these are who you want to throw to in the red zone.
And 10 yards per catch, which is like the league average for tight ends. I thought this kid was a receiver. That's how we touted him coming out of college. Dawson Knox had 14 yards per catch. Dawson Knox had like 100 fewer yards on half the targets.
Yeah, it's baffling. Well, and again, that's why I was so high on him. They didn't have a definitive wide receiver 1. You drafted him to basically be your starting slot receiver because he can't block for shit. So he's going to be split out on the slot or out wide to take advantage of smaller corners.
Just couldn't do it.
He's not doing it. Like, your job is to play receiver. They're not even teaching you blocking techniques, bro. Go catch the fucking football. Yeah, you're not doing it.
You can't claim confusion. Josh, I was going to save this comment for later, and I'm going to bring it back up later. I'm not going to unstar it, but Vince did chime in here that wasn't Anthony Richardson going 101 in some Scott Fishbowl drafts. And we talked mildly about this. In Superflex leagues, there's a case to be made for Anthony Richardson. And Vince, hold on to that thought because that's going to come up a little bit later in the show. So, Josh, as we move on to the final category, no questions to go through this time. And this is the one where I feel like these are the ones that really tug at the heartstrings. And I'm going to throw Vince's other comment up here in just a second. These are the least productive players. Off-season hype, whether it's our own hype, whether it's the media hype, I guess we're media, whatever. These players didn't live up to those expectations. So let's get into it. I'm going to read off the list. Then we'll talk about some of these guys. Kyler Murray, finished as the QB 10. Caleb Williams as the 16. Matthew Stafford as the QB 19. Kirk Cousins as the QB 21. Ramondre Stevenson, drafted as the RB 22, finishes as the RB 28. Doesn't sound like a big disappointment, but if you watched him play, it was. Same thing with Javonte Williams. Drafted as the RB 26, finishes as the RB 30. Zamir White, drafted as the RB 23, and yes, he missed games, but finished as the RB 87. Michael Pittman, drafted as the wide receiver 18, finished as the 41. Cooper Kupp, and it was a little debatable putting him on this list, but I think after what we've seen over the last 4 weeks, he belongs here. Wide receiver 17, drafted, finished as the 38. He did miss 5 games this season. Jalen Waddle has been a victim of me all season long. Drafted as the wide receiver 20, finished as the wide receiver 46. George Pickens, drafted as the wide receiver 26, finished as the 42. Diontae Johnson, drafted as the 37, finished as the 86. And Kyle Pitts, drafted as the 8, finished as the tight end 15. And I think Vince, way back earlier in the show, summed up this category very well for us, Josh. When we asked, who was your least valuable player, Vince said, it's Kyler, just trash, no injuries to blame. And that was kind of the point of this category, is these guys just sucked this year, plain and simple. And Vince points out no consistency from Kyler. ADP was high enough to make it matter. And I agreed with him on that. I tried to stick with like the top 5 quarterbacks for ADP for that category, whereas Kyler fell outside of that. But the fact of the matter is he didn't live up to expectations at all this season.
Yeah,
and maybe killed Marvin Harrison.
Well, yeah, exactly. Like I didn't highlight Kyler because I feel like, again, he still finished as the top 10 quarterback, and that's basically where his ADP was. Like it was flat, top 10, right?
Yeah.
But there were a lot of people that were talking him up as like top 5 upside, like, he was going to have this like all-star type season. And even when I did my projections, I really didn't see it.
I didn't either.
I had him at 3,862 passing yards, 22 touchdowns, 11 interceptions, about 539 rushing yards. I'm actually kind of curious now what he finished with, but he landed at, where's Kyler? 3,851 passing yards, 21 touchdowns, 11 interceptions, 572 rushing yards. Could I have been any more right about that?
I was gonna say, yeah.
Like, he basically did what I thought he was going to do. I understand everybody else that was super high on him, but we were still putting very unrealistic expectations on Marvin Harrison. I didn't have Marvin Harrison that high in my rankings.
I think that's a good point.
But, like, I still had him playing better and finishing better than what he did. But this is still a growing offense. So, again, it just boils down to we got too high. The same way that I got too high for Kincaid, we got too high for Kyler Murray. We bought hook, line, and sinker into an up-and-coming offense that truly I don't know why we were so up-and-coming with this offense. I really don't.
Yeah. No, I think it makes a lot of sense. And then you did want to talk about a division mate, Matthew Stafford, who's it's funny. I bring this up every time we talk about the Rams. We thought the defense was going to be the problem. Turns out it was the passing game.
Well, the defense was the problem the first half of the
That's
season.
true too. Yeah.
Then those young kids got hungry and said, you know what? We actually know how to play football.
Yeah.
No, the reason I highlighted Stafford was because we had a lot of questions, especially in our quarterback rankings show. It was, there's a lot of quarterbacks that we could probably get by with because it's always a position where you end up streaming a lot. And there's a lot of value later on by passing on some of those higher drafted players, right? And for me, the lowest I was willing to go was Stafford at quarterback.
Yeah, I remember that.
And he did not fit that bill.
Well, he finished right where he was being drafted.
There was only about 4 games where I probably felt comfortable.
Wanted to start him. Yeah, that's fair.
He obviously had a couple, 4 touchdown games, some 2 touchdown games here and there. I know that, the injuries to Puka and Cooper Kupp obviously played a role in that first half of the season. So I'm not going to totally hold that against him. But if you're a veteran quarterback, you're a good quarterback. You're supposed to still be a good quarterback. You got to figure out how to move off of that, right? And this team just wasn't doing that.
No.
But the moment Puka came back, oh, there's some life in Matthew Stafford.
Yeah.
But it still wasn't, damn, Matthew Stafford, top 10 quarterback. Let's fucking go.
No.
And a lot of that was because Cooper Kupp just wasn't Cooper Kupp the last month and a half of the season.
Stafford kept throwing to him. He just couldn't do shit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And at a certain point, it's like, dude, you're a 32-year-old wide receiver that can't get open. I got to go somewhere else. Sorry, man.
Yeah.
I don't care how many pancakes we shared at breakfast. Like, it's not it.
He likes them Hawaiian pancakes now with Puka Nacua. I normally save comments for the end, but Joe Ortiz made me laugh in the middle of your take when he said he almost won a best ball league with Murray and Tua. The problem was he had Murray and Tua.
We're not laughing at you, Joe. I promise.
I'm sure Joe knows we're laughing with him. Josh, I don't know that this show would have been complete without talking about Zamir White. What was it? 4 games of 2023 was enough for the fantasy world to buy in. And I don't know, Josh, there will be somebody out there who claims they were. I don't know many people who weren't bought in on Zamir White. He had literally no competition. We thought just by rule, he was going to get 300 touches this year. It didn't matter how many touches they gave him. He could not do shit with the football. Wow. Did he dupe us all in 2023?
Yeah, I mean, he was my RB26 going into the season. I had him above DeAndre Swift and Aaron Jones and Austin Eckler, Chase Brown. Oh, that's a big miss on my part. But like, I mean, it all boiled down to opportunity, right? Like for me, it wasn't so much, hey, 4 great games. Yeah, sign me the fuck up, right? Are you really going to give the ball to Alexander Madison?
Exactly. There was
so no like, that's what it boils down to for me. Like,
yeah.
Again, I've never met a defensive head coach that didn't want to run the football. Like, they all talked about, hey, we're going to give him everything that he can handle. Turns out he really couldn't handle much. But he ended the season on IR, but even when he was healthy, like, and we talked about it. I think it was week 4 when they played Carolina. It was like, look, this is the worst run defense in the league. Statistically, they were one of the worst overall defenses of all time.
Yeah.
If you can't do it against Carolina, you don't belong on a fantasy football roster.
You're done.
Well, Zamir White couldn't do it against Carolina and no longer belonged on a fantasy football roster.
Yeah, and
oddly enough, Javonte Williams couldn't do it against Carolina either.
That's interesting.
Who also made this list?
Yeah, I was gonna say that's maybe we just need to go back and see who struggled against Carolina and get off of those guys.
I'm pretty sure those were the only 2.
Gosh, you didn't highlight him, but I do feel like we have to talk about George Pickens a little bit, just because
probably him and Jalen Waddle, honestly.
Yeah. I say, well, Waddle, we've touched on Waddle because Tyreek was already mentioned. Yeah. I still think Waddle is a good wide receiver. I think what we saw in 2022 or whatever, 2023 was a mirage, where these guys were both averaging like over 18 yards per catch. I don't think it's as bad as it was this year. Waddle, I'm unlikely to draft him based on ADP. We'll have to see where that shakes out next year. I'm not giving up on Jalen Waddle as a person, but this year I was glad I didn't have him anywhere. Like, I don't know how it happened because I was so high on him the year before. But when it comes to George Pickens, Josh, I did buy in, and we always give Joe Zolo so much credit on everything. I think we can also give him some down when it comes to George Pickens. Pickens, you put this very good, Josh, on an episode we did of our Monday show. Maybe it was our Tuesday show, where I said he's boom or bust. And you said, where's the boom? Because at that point, he wasn't scoring any touchdowns because this was still in the Justin Fields days. And so I think that's the biggest thing.
What do you end up with? 4? 5?
I think 4 seems right. But the fact of the matter is,
keep talking. I'll check.
Me and you've talked about this before. It's so funny that I got bought in. I don't draft or play with wide receivers like George Pickens unless it's best ball. I have to know who I can start. why am I going to create my own roster headache? There is one player that is worth it to me, and that's Mike Evans. He is my favorite player. I will, and his down isn't as bad as George Pickens' down, let me be clear. But Mike Evans can be called boom or bust. I will put Mike Evans happily into my wide receiver 1 spot and not move him the entire season. I'm not putting George Pickens in my wide receiver 3 spot and not move. I would need to have 2 flex spots on top of 3 wide receivers before George Pickens has a safe spot on my roster. And Josh, I don't draft guys like that. I'm staying the fuck away from George Pickens.
Yeah, I mean, I had a lot of him in rookie drafts, and immediately after that first season, I traded them all to you.
Yep. Yeah.
In dynasty drafts.
Let's never forget the trade when Ryan decided he was out on Travis Kelce and traded Kelce for Pickens and Herbert and didn't even ask. That's Khalil Herbert, folks. And didn't even think to ask for a draft pick back. Easily the worst dynasty trade. I promise you, I am not this fucking stupid. I just got too bought in on a take.
You got high on players. It happens. David Njoku was also part of that trade.
That's okay. Thank God.
You did get a
Thank God. Okay, I did get that.
But no, he scored 3 touchdowns.
Oh.
So he actually ended as my wide receiver 35. So I was a little higher on him than what he ultimately ended. But
God,
I gave him the benefit of the doubt with 7 touchdowns because he really was the only option. But I was saying it all off season. George Pickens has never scored, going all the way back to Georgia, never scored more than 6 touchdowns. This man is allergic to the end zone.
Yeah.
Either that or he just finds himself on some really shitty fucking teams that don't realize that he actually can make some good catches, but he can't separate. That's the problem. That's why he ends up with all of these big catches. And we talked about this earlier in the show when we were talking about Sam Darnold. A lot of these younger quarterbacks, they need the wide receiver to be wide open. Otherwise, they're not going to throw it, or they're going to hold on to the ball too long and they're going to take a sack.
Yeah.
That's why separation is so important for a lot of these young quarterbacks these days. If you're an elite, like a crazy talented wide receiver, which George Pickens is a crazy talented wide receiver, I give him all of that credit, but he cannot separate. So that's why when Justin Fields was there, he wasn't looking for him when it mattered most.
Yep.
Because he can't separate.
And then Joshua, as we wrap up the wide receivers, I feel it's all due respect, I got to give you some time to talk about Diontae Johnson, because obviously me, who buys in hook, line, and sinker for Bryce Young and the Panthers every season, I thought this was a match made in heaven. You have an aging Adam Thielen. Well, they just could not make things work, Josh. And then Diontae Johnson couldn't make anything work.
Yeah, clearly the losing got to him. That's the only thing I can think of.
That's fair.
But obviously the yo-yo act, between Bryce and Andy Dalton.
Yeah. The
early part of the season, this offense just wasn't good. Like, all Diontae had to do was just take a step back, take a deep breath, because Bryce Young started to figure it out. And if he'd stuck through it, I think we're having a very different conversation about Diontae Johnson.
Yeah.
But because of the offseason where Pittsburgh basically said, we're just going to throw you into exile, I think that really got into his head. And then it looked
like exile for the first 8 games.
It looked like exile, exactly. And it sort of became, this is not where I want to play football. I'm here to win because I know how talented I am and I can contribute to a winner. Well, then he ends up going to Baltimore after the trade deadline, and then basically refuses to go back into a game against the Eagles, which I really don't know what that was about. But then you're basically cut afterwards. You end up in Houston where there's plenty of opportunity, but then couldn't get over the likes of Robert Woods and Xavier
Bobby
Hutchinson.
Trees.
It's just nothing about this season has made any sense when it came to Diontae Johnson. And I'm really upset with myself because when the trade initially happened where Pittsburgh sent him to Carolina, I was out on Diontae Johnson.
Yeah.
I was out. And I let myself get back in. I started listening to people talk about potential target volume and all this stuff, completely ignoring This is a bad team. Don't invest in wide receivers on a bad team. And I loaded up on Diontae Johnson.
Yeah.
And it came back, not necessarily bite me, but yeah, it hurt. Plain and simple.
Guys, those are the candidates. Those are the players that ruin your fantasy season. They're all the least valuable players, but there can be only one. And we have to list our top 3. I'll let Josh talk about his first. I'll let you know what Joe Zolo said. That is Zamir White, Anthony Richardson, and Kyle Shanahan is Joe's third. There's a reason that that's going to matter here in a moment. For me, Josh, I went Christian McCaffrey. The draft capital just made too much sense. He has to be listed. The second one for me was personal. Deebo Samuel. Josh, you and I got into fights all preseason. I was too high on Deebo. You were right. I was wrong. Enjoy that sentence for the very few times that I'll ever be willing to say it. So Deebo hurt me. So again, my first 2 picks are Deebo and Christian McCaffrey, thus making Kyle Shanahan probably mine. And then Dalton Kincaid, Josh, I just think when you get so hyped up on a tight end and he's going off the board as the tight end 5 and just doesn't even make the top 30 at a position where you have to be in the top 10, that has to be looked at. And it was very hard for me, Josh, to leave Jalen Waddle and Zamir White off of this list. It was not as hard for me to leave Anthony Richardson off because as someone who streams quarterback, I can and did survive Anthony Richardson. I picked up a team that was auto drafted and had Anthony Richardson. I would have never drafted him, but I picked up this auto draft team that had Anthony Richardson. I made it to the championship in that league by streaming quarterbacks. I picked up Jameis Winston. I think I had Drake May. I did a lot of different things at quarterback in a 16-team league. So to me, that's why I wasn't able to list him as least valuable. I understand folks who do, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But for me, it's Christian McCaffrey, it's Deebo Samuel, and it's Dalton Kincaid. Josh, who are yours?
CMC. We talked about it earlier. I mean, when you go the 101 and you're averaging 11.9 fantasy points per game, you take the 4 games played out of the equation at that point. You weren't performing even in the games you were playing. Like there was one of his Carolina seasons where he played only 3 games and averaged 27 fantasy. I
remember that. Like that was
like that to me. You're very valuable at that point. You're just unlucky, right?
Exactly.
This is the antithesis of that. This is, if I got this production from the 101, I would be breaking screens and doing things that the FBI would probably be tracking at this point because I'd be so pissed. Like, that's how rabid fantasy managers can be when it comes to this stuff. Anthony Richardson, again, it just boils down to the value. I could have very easily put CJ Stroud here as well. It's not because I was spending these high draft picks on these guys,
not.
But when you're sitting here telling me that you have QB1 overall potential and you deliver not even QB20 production.
Yeah, it's terrible.
That's not, especially in Superflex, right? Like we both play in a ton of Superflex leagues, not necessarily in redraft, but in, Dynasty and, Scott Fishbowl and things like that. Like, that's going to come into play. And of course, I had to put Diontae Johnson just because, it's my dude, and it was a huge letdown, and it's becoming very difficult to be a Diontae Johnson truther at this point. But 2025 is the redemption tour, baby.
It'll be a lot cheaper next season.
It'll be a lot cheaper next year. Exactly. He'll be that round 18 best ball pick for me.
Vince wants to know, was Gator the guy who auto-picked Anthony Richardson? No,
he might have been.
This was.
Although I will give Gator some credit. I invited him to a Dynasty League where I have a couple openings, and he had the choice of 3 different orphan teams, one of which had Anthony Richardson, and he did not take that team. So I will give him credit.
That's awesome. All right, guys. Well, you heard our nominees. The winner is Christian McCaffrey, of course. When the 101 does this, of course, they're the least valuable player. So while me and Joe both had 2 of Josh's 3 choices, the one we all agree on, because while Joe said Kyle Shanahan, is Christian McCaffrey. I don't think we need many notes, but Josh, you did add a side note, and that's why I wanted to save that comment from earlier in the show, because Vince brought up, wasn't Anthony Richardson going 101 in some Superflex drafts, which is why you added
if we're talking about super flex leagues, Anthony Richardson is 1,000% the least valuable player. Straight up.
I think we'll go down. And again, and we probably weren't the only ones to say this, but we said wait 7 rounds and take Jaden Daniels. Yep. and that'll be my 100%. Favorite. So yes, in super flex, it's Anthony Richardson. In redraft, it is without a doubt Christian McCaffrey. Guys, that wraps up the least valuable players show. Next week, we break down the lessons learned from the 2024 season, things that you can hopefully take away to prep for those 2025 drafts. We did a mock draft a few weeks ago where we saw some really interesting things. Make sure you guys are following Club Fantasy at Club Fantasy FFL on Twitter, and Jay, who Josh, I'm going to get this wrong. Is it Gator_J?
It's Gator_J. That's spelled out JAY_.
Because Jay already has our mock draft room live and kicking. There is a super flex mock with a 1-hour timer going on right now for you absolute degenerates. So if you guys are not following Jay, make sure you give him a follow. He has been doing such great work with our little chat that we have going on for Club Fantasy mock drafts on Sleeper. He can get you added to that group. If you're looking to do mocks, Jay will take great care of you. As I point out every single week, No Punt Intended is a 52-week show. We are going to be here every Wednesday for you. There is no off season. There will be some dynasty content coming later. I'll start my mock drafts back up in March, but from now to the end of the playoffs, this show is going to be here for you, just like it's going to be every other week. For Josh, I'm Ryan. Make sure you're following Club Fantasy on all the socials at Club Fantasy FFL. We will see you guys next week. Always remember, defense wins championships. Offense wins fantasy football. 2024 lessons learned next week. See you on Wednesday. Bye.